Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. I've posted a whole bunch of videos here on this channel, roughly one a week since 2009. I don't expect you to have watched all of them, but I do want to make sure that you've seen the best of them, and that's what this video is. What you're about to watch are my three of my most popular mixing videos. So if you love to mix and you want to learn how it works and how to become a much more confident mix engineer, set aside roughly 40 minutes to sit down, grab a nice beverage, that's not a beverage, and work through this video. I promise it'll transform your mixes. All right, let's dive in. Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner, and today I'm going to share with you my 3 rules for EQ. Now, I've been mixing for a long time, and these are 3 of probably the most effective habits that I've developed as a mix engineer over the years, and I want to share them with you because I guarantee they're going to help you get better mixes that look way better than that drawing. Rule number 1, balance the frequencies. This might sound like the most obvious statement in the history of mixing, but it's easy to miss. If you think about your mixing and you're thinking of EQ as just another tool to create cool sounds, while it can do that, the primary use of EQ is to balance the frequencies. You reach for an EQ, maybe you don't even realize this, but every time you reach for an EQ, you're doing it because something is not balanced. We have a hearing that ranges from around 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. And when we're listening to music, we kind of want to hear all those frequencies. If I listen to your mix and I'm getting a huge bump of frequencies here at like the 200 hertz range, and everything else relative to that is down here in volume, guess what? Your mix is going to sound muddy. It's going to be out of balance. If I was mastering that, I would reach for an EQ that would do the opposite of this. So my EQ curve would look something like this. I would do a dip here in order to get things to balance out again. Now, I'm using visuals to show you something that must be done with your ears, but it's a helpful visual. I encourage you not to just do it visually. You're not going for a flat EQ curve, you're going for a balanced EQ curve. When I listen to a great sounding mix, if this is completely flat, I'm probably hearing maybe a little more lows and a little less highs generally if you're talking about the way it looks visually. So don't go off the visual, go off of what you hear. If I hear that there's a lot of mud, I'm going to cut some of that mud. If I hear that somebody got rid of all the high end and it sounds very dull, I might come in and boost the high end. See how these are complementary, almost mirror images of each other? That's what we're going for when we EQ. We're trying to balance the frequencies. Rule number 2, get to know the 5 frequency ranges. This, I'm embarrassed to say, I went a long time before really understanding this, and it kind of solidified in my brain when I was listening to something Ian Shepherd did. So he was talking about the different frequency ranges for mastering, and it clicked something inside of me that I want to share with you. So the 5 frequency ranges can be anything, but I like to use big whole numbers. So everything's going to be in terms of hertz. We got 50 hertz, we got 100 hertz, we got 500 hertz, 1,000 hertz, and 10,000 hertz. Those are the ranges I'm talking about. Maybe we're talking, it's a range, so this could be, when I think of 500 hertz, that range, I think of anything from down to maybe 300 up to 800, something like that, okay? But these are kind of the general areas that I think about when I'm thinking about EQ and the different ranges. So as I said in rule number 1, we need to hear all of these frequencies. We don't need any of them to be absent or any of them to be super prominent. They need to be balanced, but also sometimes we can get confused. For a long time, I thought 100 hertz was the deep low end in a mix. And it's not really. 50 hertz is the really deep low end. 100 is what Ian Shepherd calls the hooting frequency. Next time you do a big boost at 100 hertz, listen. Instead of being like boom, boom, it's more like hoo, hoo. It's a hooting frequency. So let's talk about the good and the bad when it comes to these different frequency ranges. When things are good, I'll tell you what each of them sound like. When things are bad, I'll tell you what each of them sounds like. And it'll help you kind of start to wrap your mind around and really get to know what each of these ranges sounds like. Okay? Let's go with the super lows. 50 hertz in that area. When things are good down here, the mix has a whole lot of punch. The kick drum hits you in the chest. The bass guitar is huge and full. It just has this nice, deep, low end to it. If this is out of control, you can end up with a very boomy sound. When there's too much of this, you find that low boost and you go nuts and you boost everything. And maybe on your tiny speakers it might sound good, but in the real world, on real speakers, it's way too boomy. Okay, let's move on to the hooting frequency, 100 hertz. When it's in the right place, things can sound incredibly warm. Warmth is like that catchphrase. It's that thing we hear when people talk about tubes, for example, or great microphones. They're very warm. Typically, that means somewhere in that 1 to 200 hertz range has some good, warm-sounding frequencies. However, if things are not as they should be here, especially if there's too much, which seems to be the case most of the time, you end up with something that sounds muddy. Muddy is bad. I find myself doing a lot of work in this range, taking a lot of frequencies down that sound muddy and maybe occasionally boosting some to increase the warmth of the track. And that can go up as high as 400 hertz, but typically 100 is kind of the starting point there. 1 to 200, I would say. We'll put to 200 there. Okay, now let's move on to 500 hertz. 500 hertz can be tricky because that's where a lot of vocal frequencies and honestly every other instrument occupies a decent chunk of these two spaces anyway, so you tend to have a lot of build up here. But when 500 hertz and the surrounding frequencies are acting nicely, you can have a nice full mix. To me, fullness is different from warmth. Warmth typically has to do with low end. Fullness has to do with overall feeling big. When you're missing the frequencies here and they're not working right, or if there's too much of those frequencies, things can start to feel boxy. Almost like if you recorded something in a completely bare room with drywall everywhere and tile floors. There's a resonance in like the 500 hertz range that just doesn't sound good. The sound of drywall. That's what happens when there's too much going on there. A lot of times on room mics recorded in home studios, I'll do a big cut here, 400 or 500 hertz, makes a huge difference in the drums. Now we're getting up into the higher frequencies, 1,000 hertz up to like 3,000 hertz. When things are going well, it can be, this is going to sound negative, but you'll understand in a second. It has a little bit of, no, not nasal. That's descriptive, but let's go with clarity. A lot of the clarity of a track happens in the high frequencies, especially kind of being able to really understand what the singer is singing is in that kind of 1 to 3K range. However, if there's too much going on up in these upper mid-range, these high mid frequencies, you end up with a lot of harshness. And if your mix is sounding harsh, chances are something up in this area is out of whack and there's too much going on. Or perhaps there's too little over here. We'll talk about that in just a second. And up at 10K, when it's doing 10K and above are working well, it adds this nice, crisp airiness to the track. But when, and I hear it all too often, when people go nuts and start boosting like crazy up here, it can sound strident. The term ice pick comes to mind because it can be just so hard to listen to. You have to turn your speakers down. Now, typically, this is something that people with some significant hearing loss tend to have brighter mixes because they're boosting those highs so incredibly much so that they can hear them. But in reality, for the rest of the listening world, it's too much up in this range. Okay, on to rule number 3. Yeah. Rule number 3, think like a sculptor. I.e., think like someone who makes sculptures. I handed you a big piece of marble and I said, turn it into a dinosaur. Well, you're going to have to remove a large chunk of that marble in order to create the dinosaur. You can't pick up the marble and add it back on, right? So that's the way I like to think about EQ. When I'm looking at the EQ of something, I like to do something like this before I go in and do something like this. So these are 2 boosts. This is a cut. I prefer to cut before I boost. Now, does that mean that boosting is wrong? No. In the past, I've said things like, boosting is the devil. Boosting's not the devil. It's just that a lot of times we're combining lots of tracks together, and those tracks are going to build up in different frequency ranges. And so by boosting is addition, cutting is subtraction. I would prefer to take all this excess of sound that I have and remove some of the pieces so that it leaves something beautiful. If I'm only boosting with EQ, I'm taking this sound that I have and I'm piling more sound on top of it, and I end up with more than I started. And generally speaking, that's going to be worse because I've not removed the offending frequencies. I've only added more good frequencies on top. So if let's think of it this way. If I listen to the raw tracks, and here's the lows, here's the highs, here's kind of the flat curve. If I'm listening and just to my ears, it sounds like this. There's a bunch of low end and there's a bunch of high end. And then I decide that it needs some mid-range. And so I do some sort of EQ boost here. So now the curve is like this. I've added mid-range, but I still have too much low end and too much high end. I'm still probably going to need to bring these down. The answer is probably to do some EQ cuts in the low end, maybe a boost in the high end and cuts in the, or boost in the mid-range and cuts in the low end to get the net result of a flatter, smoother, more natural sounding EQ or balance like we talked about at the very beginning. All right, that's it for this video on mixing with EQ. Hopefully you've gotten at least one idea that you can take and try on one of your mixes, and it'll make a huge difference on the overall quality of that mix. If it does, come back here and leave a comment below and let us know how it goes. We'd love to hear your success stories. If you want more from me on mixing, then you'd get a big kick out of 5stepmix.com. That is a free 5-step mixing guide that I've created that you can read in about 10 minutes, and it'll help you put a framework around how you approach a mix. So when you go from the start of the mix and you're wandering and you're not sure where the end is, this guide will help you by giving you kind of markers along the way that you can follow that will help you get to that wonderful but elusive finish line. Thanks so much for watching the video. I'm Joe from Home Studio Corner. See you in the next one. Hey, this is Joe Gilder from Home Studio Corner, and today we're going to talk about the 6 rules of compression. Now, let me just go ahead and preemptively say to the person who's dying to comment, there are no rules. Of course, there are no rules, but at the same time, there are. There's rules of music theory. Now, you can break those rules as much as you want, all the way to making atonal music that sounds like garbage, but these are the rules that I've come up with how I use compression in a way that works well for me and helps me get mixes that I'm proud of and that sound good to me. So if you're feeling like your compression game could use a little bit of a booster shot, that's what this video is for. It's going to help you get better mixes by getting a better handle on compression. Okay, we need some boxes for our rules because, you know, rules tend to box us in. And, you know, we push back against being boxed in. I get that. But boxes can be good and can be helpful. Now, of these 6 rules, I would say rule number 1 and rule number 6 are the most important. Rules 2 through 5, still important, but these are going to be the biggest game-changing ones for you if you get those under control. So let's zoom in and let's talk about rule number 1. Rule number 1 is very simple, but very important. And it's simply this: don't compress everything. You can call it human nature if you want, but there's something about having a tool that we love and that we know how to use that makes us want to put it on everything. The same is true for EQ or reverb. Too much of a good thing is, of course, a bad thing. So just because you look over and you see your insert section on your channels and you think, oh, it would be so nice to put a big, fat, juicy compressor plug-in right here, don't do it. Don't do it. If the track needs it, sure. But before you put any plug-in on a track, you should be able to answer the question, why am I putting it on this track? What sound am I going for? What's not in the track? What's not happening here that requires me to put a compressor on the track? Otherwise, you might just want to leave it alone. I've had so many mixes where I put nothing on some of the tracks, and that ends up being the best decision, okay? Don't compress everything. All right, rule number 2, once you've decided that you want to use some compression, try this. Try compressing the bus first. Now, what do I mean by the bus? Let's imagine, the easiest explanation for this is to imagine we've got a bunch of drum tracks. So let's say we've got a bunch of drum tracks here. These are faders. Can't you tell? They're beautiful. And so these are things like, We got our kick drum, our snare, tom, overhead, room mics, okay? Now, all of these are typically, if you set your session up kind of the way I do, these are all routed to our drum bus, which I usually call like drums in all caps. The best place, in my opinion, to put a compressor is right here. If you're thinking about compressing your drums, why not put the compressor on the drums bus first? You can always go back and put it on individual channels as well. But a lot of times, if I know that I want to compress the kick drum and the snare drum, and then, a lot of times, especially in Nashville, they like to put compressors on the rooms. I could do all that, but what if I could just do one compressor here on my drum bus, and that solved all my problems? That did some compression on the kick and also the snare and also the rooms with just one single compressor. That's the approach I like to take. This is what I call, backwards mixing or top-down mixing. One compressor here can maybe do the job across 5 or 10 or 12 tracks to where maybe I don't end up needing a compressor on my kick drum or my snare drum, or I can compress it differently because this compressor is already giving me some of the tone that I want. Now, the important thing here is to just try this. You don't always do it. There are times when I don't do that, but especially on drums, I find this works really, really well. Okay, rule number 3 has to do with the age-old question, which do I do first, EQ or compress? I've got a basic rule of thumb that works really well for me. So, it's kind of a two-parter. That's supposed to be an ear. If it sounds good, compress first. Okay? The second part of this, that's a better ear, sounds bad, EQ first. Okay? So what do I mean by good and bad? Obviously, we want to get things right and we want to make our track sound as good as possible at the source. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And what happens with compression tends to just amplify. So if we take a track that has a lot of good and a lot of bad and we compress it, we're just turning up both the good and the bad. No matter what we do, good and bad get turned up. However, if we use some EQ, let's say there's just a few bad frequencies in that channel, we can turn those bad frequencies down a little bit, get them more in control so that there's less bad in relation to the good. The bad is like this size and the good is this size. Now, if we come in and we slap a compressor on this and the compressor's turning up both the good and the bad, look, now it's turning up the good and the bad is staying lower in relation to it. Okay? So if you think about it, use the EQ to fix some problems and then use the compression to do its thing and to enhance things. All right, rule number 4 has to do with the attack knob, and it's very simple. Treat your attack knob as if it is an aggression control. In other words, how aggressive do you want your compressor to be? So if you set up a compressor with kind of the normal, 2-to-1 ratio and the threshold's in a spot where it's compressing just a decent amount, a few dB, and then you would take your attack knob and you turn that sucker down, so you're going from, let's say, 30 milliseconds over here down to 1 millisecond over here. Guess what? By doing nothing else but changing the attack time, you're going to see more compression on your compressor. You're going to look at the gain reduction meter and you're going to see that with the 30 millisecond attack, it was maybe compressing this much. And then when you brought it down to 1 millisecond, it's compressing this much. We're basically just saying, I want you to attack more of the signal, be more aggressive in your attack because it's faster. And so we end up with more compression. So if you think about it that way, that's what these things that usually have fast attack times, like, for example, vocals and snare drums. A lot of times we use, if I were to say what channels, what kind of audio do I tend to use the most aggressive compression on, it'd be stuff like this, because the faster attack times grab the vocals and the snare in such a way that sounds really cool and pleasing. So it doesn't mean I have to have a ton of compression happening. It just means when it's compressing, it has more of an aggressive quality to it. The opposite is also true. If we go from 1 millisecond and we turn the knob back over to 30 milliseconds, we get a smoother compression. We get less aggression there. So think of it in terms of aggression. Rule number 5, you might have guessed, has something to do with the release time. So if attack is aggression, then your release time is your tone. So I think of the release knob as a tone knob. So I'm a guitar player. Tone knobs on my guitars and on different pedals that I have change the overall sound of what's happening. And that to me is what release does more than anything else. It's affecting the tone. So let's transform this attack knob into a release knob now. And let's do the same thing we did before. If we set the release at something like 30 milliseconds versus 1 millisecond, what happens? So let's start with the 30 millisecond one. So here's our waveform. This is kind of the journey of the waveform here, okay? The waveform starts, compressor turns it down, and then the slow release happens, okay? So it goes on this journey kind of like that, all right? So that's with the 30 millisecond. Now, what if we turned it down to 1 millisecond release time? What happens then? Well, here's kind of what that would look like. The beginning does the same, comes back down, but then it comes back up. So the release, which is kind of right here on the audio, is pretty quick. So if you compare these two, all things being equal, this one lets the sound back in more slowly, this one lets the sound back in more quickly. Now let's imagine this is like a waveform, like a kick drum, where the beginning goes boom, and then the end goes whoom. If we have a slow release like this, that whoom is going to get turned down when we turn down the whoom. So this would sound like on a kick drum, something like this. Boom. This, on the other hand, the release is allowing the rest of the signal to come back in pretty quickly. So this would sound like boom, boom, boom. And then you can adjust the release time. So if we adjust it anywhere in between, then we get variations of this. So maybe instead of waiting that long, it goes boom, boom, or it goes boom. You see what I'm saying? You can let as much or as little as you want back in by adjusting your release knob. And finally, arguably the most important rule, especially if you're going to find yourself using quite a bit of compression, always, 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 always level match your compression. What do I mean by that? Let's take, for example, let's say we're going in and here's two of our signals. Here's the before and here's the after. And then somewhere in the middle is compression. So compression's happening here. Here's the signal going in. This is the input of the compressor. This is the output of the compressor. A lot of times what we end up doing, let's say the input is coming in like this. That's the level of the input. We do our thing with compression, and that's the output. We've made it louder. And guess what? If it's louder, we tend to think it's better. So we may go through, take a bunch of tracks that were at this level, compress them till they're at that level, and we think, hot dog, look how much better it sounds. No, louder is not better. What would be better is to take the input and then do our compression thing, have lots of fun with it, but then make sure that the output is the same as the input. Make sure that the before and after are exactly the same. In other words, if you're using, something like Studio One, you know how the plugins have this power button on there? If you've got that and you engage and disengage, you bypass the plugin, the levels of each should sound the same. That way you can hear, okay, what is this compression actually doing? Instead of just seeing, is it making it louder? Is it making it better? And by doing that, you'll realize, I actually made it worse with a compressor. Or, wow, I actually made it a whole lot better. So this is hugely important. And maybe it's the opposite. The input signal is way up here and you compressed and turned it down. Same thing. You may think it sounds better here because it's louder, but reality, this was a better sounding signal and better for the mix, but you just couldn't tell because they weren't balanced. That's why every compressor you ever use will have some sort of what they call, sometimes it's called gain, sometimes it's just called makeup gain. And it's just a knob that allows you to adjust the volume of that output of the compressor so that you can match what's coming in and what's going out. That alone, if you don't do anything else, that alone right there will help you make better compression decisions because you're not working with one hand tied behind your back. You're listening to the same thing before. All right, so those are the 6 rules of compression. I hope this was helpful. What rules do you have that I missed out on? Leave a comment below and let me know. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it was well worth your while, and I hope you get better mixes as a result. If you'd like to check out my 5-step mix guide, which will take you kind of through my process of taking a mix from the starting line all the way meandering to the finish, that will help you do it, and it's a quick and easy read. Just go to 5stepmix.com for your free copy. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner, and today I want to talk to you about my 4 rules for mixing. Now, I've been doing these rules videos for a little bit now, and they seem to be really connecting with people. And I think the reason is that there's just a lot of information out there, and even though mixing is not the most complicated thing in the world, it can get a little squirrely, especially with all the information out there. Now, I've been doing this since 2009, which is helping people get better mixes, help people learn how to make good music in a home studio environment. And that puts me in a unique position, both as a musician and producer myself, but also as the guy who's helped out thousands of people over the last decade. I've seen a lot of things, and I've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't when it comes to making music in a home studio, especially if you're just starting out. So I've got my boxes created because all rules like to be boxed in, don't they? Right, let's jump in and figure out rule number 1. All right, rule number 1. This is going to be the most important one, I would say. Always, always, always aim for, ready? You ready? You ready? What's the word? Balance. That word is so important. I'm going to highlight it. Balance is the name of the game. This is everything. This is what we're doing as engineers in the studio, as musicians, whether you're in a band playing with other musicians, whether it's just you and a guitar and you need to balance the volume of your voice with the volume of the guitar in a room full of people at a house show. Balance is so incredibly important. Back in the old days, they used to call audio engineers balance engineers because of how important, like that's what they did. They balanced things. So what are we talking about here? Well, there's 3 types of balance I want to go over with you. The first is the first part of the cheat code from Contra. If you remember that, up, up, down, down, left, right, BA, select, start, or select, start if you're playing 2 players. People will argue with me on that, but I'm right. So here are the 3 types of balance. What are they? Well, these shapes probably don't make much sense. Up and down, that's volume balance. That's faders, gain staging. That is getting the levels of your tracks in your mix balanced together. So you get them all to where you can hear everything and you're not clipping your main bus. It sounds simple, but it's super important. More on that in a second. The second one is left and right balance, stereo balance, the balance of panning. If I have a really great killer sounding guitar track, that's a guitar, and I love it, and I pan it over to the left, well, now I've got to think, okay, what, if I leave it there, then I've got this stereo mix that's left heavy with that guitar. What am I going to put over here on the right side to balance that out? That's what I'm thinking about when I'm recording guitar. It's also obviously what I'm thinking about a lot when I'm mixing. What do I do to achieve a left and right balance? You could put everything up the middle. That's technically balanced, but we'd much rather take advantage of the stereo spectrum. So if something goes left, something else has to go right. Third type of balance is frequency balance. This is the one people will jump to. They'll want to pull up their big EQ plugin and want to make the EQ curves look all cool and yeah, look at that EQ curve. But while it is important, I would say the first 2 are more important, and then use the third to achieve frequency balance. And what I mean by that, if you've seen my rules of EQ video, there are different bands of frequencies, and we want them all to be roughly the same volume. We don't want there to be way more in the low mids and way more in the highs than everything else. So we use EQ to balance those things out, okay? Balance engineers, right? That's rule number 1. All right, let's dive into rule number 2, which is similar or builds upon rule number 1. I feel so fancy when I say the word upon. And that is this: no plugins too early. What a lot of people like to do. We love plugins. We love toys. We want to pull out our plugins, slap them on all our tracks, and just have fun. I'm all for fun. I love fun. But you will not have fun if you start grabbing for your plugins before you've done what I consider one of the most important parts of the mix process, and that is the static mix. What's the static mix, you ask? The static mix is this right here. Getting your up, down, and left, right in order. Meaning you're going to work on getting your levels and your panning sounding great. Now, the static mix, it can take upwards of an hour or more. I had a song I remember where it had 60 or 70 tracks. I spent like an hour and a half just on the static mix, 0 plugins involved, just to get everything where it needed to go. Okay, what is this? What does it sound like? Where does it happen in the song? Do I want to pan it middle, left, or right? How loud does it need to be? and then do that over and over again to get everything where I can hear everything in the mix. I've got a good balance, up, down, left, right. That's our static mix. Once we've done that, then we can move on and start working on things like frequency balance and then using compression to further smooth out the up and down volume balance. But static mix for me is so incredibly crucial, and I really enjoy it. It's one of my favorite parts of the process because you get things like a bunch of faders lined up, right? And they each have pan knobs on top of them, and you get to just move things around. It's the part, like the reason that that fader broke. Ugh, that doesn't look like a fader. Anyway, it's the reason that we get into mixing a lot of times. We see somebody moving faders, either on a physical control surface or mixer or in a studio. Like that's what we think about when we think about mixing, is moving faders and then moving panners left and right. That's the game here with the static mix. Don't blow past this. Don't go so fast and be so eager to reach for your favorite plugin that you don't get the balance right. What ends up happening, here's the reason why. What ends up happening is you start using plugins on a mix that is not balanced, and you end up with just more imbalance, right? I've had this happen so many times. Kind of a common example where I'll have a bass guitar and it just won't sound right, and I'll pull out things like EQ and compression and maybe even distortion, and I will spend upwards of 20-30 minutes on that bass track to make it sound good. Then I'll take all the plugins off and say, oh, it's just too quiet, and I'll take the fader and turn it up. Problem solved. And then maybe use just a little bit of EQ and a little bit of compression. That is a very common scenario in mixing. We tend to think that we need to put all these plugins on every single track, when in reality, if we set them at the right volume, we might not need those plugins. Or if we do, we can wait and use them until later so we don't jack things up. That takes me very nicely into our next rule, which happens to be rule number 3 for those math nerds among us, and that is to be this isn't going to fit, minimalist. Look at that. Fits perfectly. Now, what do I mean by that? Do you remember that old game show? I don't think I ever watched it, but I heard about it. And it was called Name That Tune. And the idea was they would tell you something about the song, and then you would say, I bet I can name that tune in 4 notes, or in 2 notes, or in 3 notes. And then they would play the notes and you would say, that's, Fly Me to the Moon. And then you'd win points or something. When I approach mixing, I think of it a lot like, this just, as I'm saying this sounds super weird, but I think of it a lot like approaching something like Name That Tune. Like these, let's assume these are my channels in my mix. I've already done my static mix. I've got things sounding good. And then my goal is to get these sounding as good as possible with as few plugins as possible. So instead of just loading up this thing with just plugin after plugin after plugin, what I'll do a lot of times, and this will come as no surprise if you've seen some of my mixing videos, is I'll do something like this. I'll take all of these tracks and I will send them over to some sort of a bus. Okay, something like this. And then instead of putting plugins on each of the individual tracks like that, I'll actually just put a few plugins, like 1 or 2, on the bus itself. And I will see, and I'll say to myself, all right, Joe, can you make a good mix out of all these tracks with just 1 or 2 plugins on the mix bus? And I'll tell you, more often than not, I can. Or if nothing else, I can get it 80 to 90% of the way there with just 2 plugins, and then I can come in and I can put an extra plugin on that snare drum, an extra plugin on that kick drum. So I'll do this for the big groups of things in my sessions: drums, guitars, vocals, acoustic guitars and electric guitars separately, keyboards, strings, background vocals. They'll each go to a bus. So instead of mixing, 24 or 48 songs, I'm really just mixing 8 faders. And then, yes, I'll go back and I'll do things on the individual tracks if needed, but I've shocked myself so many times with how I've been able to make this sound amazing, and there will be 0 to 3 plugins on my entire drum mix because I was able to get the job done here. Now, none of that can happen if you go for plugins too early or if you don't get a good balance to begin with. But if you do rule 1 and you do rule 2 well, then when you get to rule 3, you're able to do this. It's pretty powerful. And you either believe me or you don't. And you either get it or you don't. And the only way you can get it is by trying it. And I've had people say, Joe, I've heard you say this for years, and I finally tried it the other day, and holy crap, it worked. And I'm over here saying, Yes, it does. Rule number 4, pay attention. This one's a little weird. I've not talked about this a ton. Pay attention to your body. Okay, here's what I mean. Let's say you are working on a mix, okay? And you got your speakers set up over here, and they're just blasting some groovy tunes, right? And you're sitting here in the middle. You're a bald-headed like me, and you got this really cool chair, okay? And you're sitting here, and you got your hand on the mouse, and you're working. Maybe you're working for a couple hours, maybe 2, 3, 4 hours. Maybe it's just been 30 minutes. These are supposed to be legs on the chair. And maybe you're at a big mixing desk like that, and it's got tons of channels and knobs and faders. Anyway, here's what happens. At some point, something's going to happen to your body as relates to this music, okay? Perhaps you're going to be listening to a really beautiful ballad, okay? And you're going to start tearing up, and there'll be tears in your eyes dripping down your face. Take note of that. Or maybe it's a faster tune, and it makes you want to stand up and dance. That's you dancing, by the way. Or at least nothing else, it makes you want to bob your head to the beat, like, yeah, and you close your eyes and you bite your lip and you're like, yeah, this is good. When these things happen, any of these, when I have any sort of physical response to the music, I either want to dance, I want to cry, I get, goosebumps, which I don't know how to draw goosebumps. When any of those things happen, I make a note of it. It's a big deal to me, because what that means is all this work that I've done has created an emotional connection with my brain. It has caused me to feel something, either feel a happiness and a desire to dance, or made me feel sad or emotional, reminded me of something really great, or it makes me bob my head because I'm really grooving to the music. That means I'm almost there. That is a big red flag that says, hey, you are real close to calling this sucker done. So I will plant a flag in my brain, and I will say, okay, let's start trying to land this plane as soon as possible, because any more work that I do is potentially going to break what I've done here, and I'll no longer connect with the music anymore. And I'll have gone too far. I will have overmixed the song, which is something a lot of beginners do. Remember, be a minimalist. Keep it simple. Go for balance. Use plugins sparsely, none at first, and then slowly add them in. Use a minimalist approach. Mix that song in as few plugins as possible and as few moves as possible. And then when you start bouncing to the music, then start to try to land the plane and see how quickly you can finish and be done, because that means you're there or you're close, and you can start finishing things up so you don't overmix and lose that mojo that you have right there. And finally, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video. If it was helpful for you and you want to take the next step with me, you can sign up for my 5-step mix guide for free. Just go to 5stepmix.com. Thanks for watching.